Hello, we'll come here in Genesis 30 and we are going to talk about the conflict in Jacob's house. And we begin here in Genesis as we've seen this man Jacob has went to this Pandanara. This is the place that he is in Syria, and he's outside Canaan. And here he went to his uncle's house, and here you have two daughters. His uncle has two daughters, Leah and Rachel. And Jacob ended up, thought he was going to marry Rachel, but now ended up marrying Leah. And then he has to work for another 7 years to get Rachel. But now he's now at the place where he has to serve his uncle Laban for another 7 years, and he's in his house. And this is the inside of the conflict that is happening in his household. And it begins here in Genesis chapter 1. It says, "And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said unto Jacob, Give me children, or else I'll die." And poor Rachel here, you have a conflict in Jacob's house with two wives. And here is the two wives that God did not approve. Again, the polygamy in the Bible means that it's a historical record that happened. Does not mean that God approved it. But you have circumstances that came, and this man have two wives, and one wife needs is to be fulfilled here. And here you see the envy. Envy becomes the course meal of the day in the home of Jacob. And here you have the conflict between these two wives, and it's a constant friction. And for one thing, Leah, she needed love and affection because she did not get it from her father and her husband, and she is unloved. And here you have Rachel, the well-favored one, and this is the woman that Jacob wanted. This is the woman she loved. But the problem is that she's barren. She has no children. And you have also Laban, Jacob's uncle, and he's smuggling Jacob, and now you have all these going on in a constant friction in this house. And you see Rachel here is saying to Jacob, he said, Give me children or I'll die. And Rachel is here nagging Jacob. And in verse 2 it says, And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel. And he said, Am I in God's stead, who had withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? Now, this is constant friction and nagging that was going on in the household of Jacob. And Rachel begins to, tell Jacob to give me children or I'll die. And now Jacob has lost it. He loves Rachel, but now is getting frustrated with her. And constant friction and nagging that was going on. And he said, Am I in God's stead, who had withheld from you the fruit of the womb? And this has to hurt. This had to hurt. And you have this woman that had everything, but now she's now has no children. And desperation is now going to set in. Just like Abraham and Sarah, if you read in Genesis 16 verse 2, it says, And Sarai, Abraham's wife, said unto Abraham, Behold, now the Lord had restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go into my maid. It may be that I obtain children by her. Now this is a desperation now. And again, the word go into has to do with not right intercourse here, not God approved intercourse here. And this is intercourse that God does not want. God wants one man and one woman in a household, married. But here now, this desperation is going to set in because of Rachel, and she's going to try to get manufacture children here. And then in here in verse 3 it says, and she said, behold, my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her. And she gave him Bilhah her handmaid to wife. And Jacob went in unto her, and Bilhah conceived, and bare Jacob a son. And Rachel said, God had judged me, and had also heard my voice, and had given me a son. Therefore called she his name Dan. Now, again, this is a desperate woman here, and she now sends one of her handmaid, Bilhah, to give it to Jacob for wife. And he said, go in unto her. In other words, not to know her, but again, go in. This is illegal sex again, and that she will bear children on her knees. That she will dangle children on her knees. And these, keep in mind that this is also the custom of the day. And when a wife couldn't bear a child, usually a concubine will be given. And in this case, she gave the concubine, well, her handmaid, to Jacob. And Jacob went into her. Again, this woman is Bilhah, and she conceived, and then she bare a son, and called his name, again by Rachel. Rachel called his name Dan. And she said that God had judged me and has seen my cause. And now she brings God into it. You see, now she's becoming religion, just like all other example, like Rebecca and all these things that that happen in these circumstances. Usually they bring God in, as God is the one that approve of this, but God was not approving of this. You see, God is not in this. And she said, God has judged me because this is her sin. This is not God's approval. And this was nothing but envy. She had a spirit of envy, and she was filled with envy with this. And it says God has judged me and has seen my cause. Judge me from whom? You see, this is envy. Judge me between me and my sister, Leah. Now, this competition that was going on, these two were envying each other. You see, now she brings God into this equation. But this comes out of envy. And then it says in verse 7, it says, and Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again and bare Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, with great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali. See, she said, with great wrestling I have wrestled with my sister. And Bilhah conceived again and had a second son from her, Rachel's handmaid. And it says, with wrestling I have wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. You see, this is a constant war between two sisters. And this is no longer about Jacob. This is no longer about her not having a child. This is just constantly about envy. And he says, Naphtali was born out of this. And envy, first of all, is evil. And this is constant about competition that was trying to go in these two sisters. They were trying to see who can outdo each other. And then in verse 9 it says, and Leah saw that she had left bearing. See, Leah now saw that she has left bearing, and she took Zilpah, her handmaid, and gave her Jacob to wife. You see, Leah saw that she cannot bear anymore. Why? Because she had Judah. Judah was the line of Christ here. She could have been satisfied. And here again, there's a competition going on with these two. And Speaking of Judah, Judah came, Christ is going to come out of the line of Judah. This is the line that Christ is going to come out of. You have Abraham, Isaac, then you have Jacob, and then you have Judah. Here, we're following the line of Christ, as I mentioned before. And then you have, in verse 10, it says, and Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob's a son. And Leah said, a troop cometh. And she called his name Dan. And Leah, you see, took Zilpah, her handmaid, and gave her to Jacob. And this really showed the character of Jacob here. He's not resisting. He's not standing on a moral ground. And he doesn't have an integrity to say, this is wrong, I can stop this. But he's just playing along with this. And here you have in verse 10, and he says here, and he bare a son by Zilpah. And it says, a troop cometh, you know, called the name of Zilpah's son, Gad. And now Gad, the word Gad in Hebrew means good fortune. That's what it means. And constant awful fight between these two. And there was no peace in the house, but you have these children that are coming out of this constant friction. And then he says in verse 12, and Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a second son. And Leah said, happy am I, for the daughters will call me blessed. And she called his name Asher. And you have Leah's handmaid Zilpah bear another son called Asher. And he says, happy of the daughters will call me blessed. And it's no longer about Jacob now. It's not talking about my husband will love me, but now she's, you know, catering for and fighting for public image. Now people will call me blessed. And so many of us like that, we seek public image of people. And that's what she does. She's looking for public image. And see, they took the fight from the home. Now they took it outside the public now. It says, the daughters will call me blessed. And moving on in verse 14, it says, and Reuben went in the days of the wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field and brought them unto his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, give me, I pray thee, of thy son's mandrakes. And she said unto her, is it a small matter that thou hast taken my husband, and wouldest thou take away my son mandrakes also? And Rachel said, therefore he shall lie with thee tonight for thy son's mandrakes. And Reuben here is the firstborn of Leah, and he went to the field and brought mandrakes. And here you see Rachel saying to Leah, give me some mandrakes. And you see the desperation in Rachel. And you know, Rachel is desperate because mandrakes were known to become or considered a herb for fertility. And Jacob and Rachel had been with each other without Leah at this point, and until this mandrake incident. And here you see Leah accused Rachel for taking her husband away from her. And now you see Rachel is now going to trade his husband for mandrakes to Leah. And this is how the desperation, how desperate Rachel was. And then in verse 16 it says, and Jacob came out of the field in the evening, and Leah went out to meet him and said, thou must come in unto me, for surely I have hired thee with my son's mandrakes. And he lay with her that night, and God hearkened unto Leah, and she conceived and bare Jacob the fifth son. See, so Leah goes out to meet Jacob. You know, shows here the distance between Leah and Jacob. There have been distance at this point, because why? Jacob loved Rachel, and Leah is married, of course, but she's alone. And she said she has to hire, you know, her husband to sleep with her. You know, she said, I've hired you with these mandrakes. And in verse 17, you know, Leah conceived and a fifth son was born, and it says his name is Issachar. So we're gonna go ahead. It says in verse 18, it says, and Leah said, God had given me my hire because I have given my maiden to my husband. And she called his name Issachar. You see, the name Issachar again means, in Hebrew, means recompense, means reward. She said, God has given me my hire. And she's still desiring to please her husband, but now she said, God has given me my hire. I've hired my husband, and called the name Issachar. And then in verse 19, and Leah conceived again and bare Jacob the sixth son. And Leah said, God had endured with me a good dowry. Now will my husband dwell with me, because I have borne him six sons. And she called his name Zebulun. She said, God is giving me a good dowry. And then the word Zebulun means gift, you know, or also to dwell. That's what it means. And she said, now my husband will dwell with me. See, Jacob was not living with her, and Jacob was not staying with her. And, you know, she was living with Rachel, you see, and because she was again unloved. And he says in verse 21, and afterwards she bare a daughter and called her name Dinah. Now, Leah's daughter Dinah is noted here despite Jacob having other daughters. And she is brought out here because there's a story behind Dinah. And we're going to talk about Dinah later on, and we're going to see her story later. And then in verse 22 it says, and God remembered Rachel. Now God remembers Rachel now, and God hearkened to her and opened her womb. And she conceived and bare a son, and said, God had taken my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, and said, the Lord shall add to me another son. You see, God now remembers Rachel. And Rachel, who couldn't bear children, is now a mother. Now she gives birth to a son, Joseph. And God opened her womb, and she said, God has taken away my reproach. And, you know, Rachel now bears Joseph, you know. And it's also, she said that the Lord will add another son to me. See, here we have Joseph now comes in. And then in verse 25 it says, and it came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said unto Laban, send me away, that I may go unto my own place and to my country. Notice Jacob waited until Rachel finally conceived. Now he asks to be, you know, that he wants to leave. And Rachel was truly dear to his heart, and now she was with child now, and then she came out and had a child, and you know, Jacob did not want Joseph to stay there in the faraway country, and now he's asking to leave. You see, because now this is a boy he always wanted. This is a child that he always wanted. This is going to be his favorite son, because now it comes from Rachel. This child comes from Rachel. Now he wants to leave now. And it says here in verse 26, it says, give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served thee. Now he goes up to Laban. He says, give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served thee, and let me go, for thou knowest my service which I have done unto thee. And Jacob, you know, he came to his tricky uncle, and he said, give me my wives and my children, of whom I have labored and I have served you. Apparently Laban was holding them in labor, you see. Through labor he was holding his children, and his children was also working for him. And Jacob's children was also working for him, and they were laboring for this uncle in the field. And now he says in verse 27, and Laban said unto him, I pray thee, if I have found favor in thy eyes, tarry. For I have learned by experience that the Lord hath blessed me for thy sake. See, he says, Laban said, the Lord, I have learned that the Lord has, blessed me for thy sake. In other words, I have learned that by Jacob being around, he was prospering. By the presence of Jacob, Laban was prospering, just like Abimelech. Notice Isaac. You notice Isaac and said that God is with you. Same thing, Abimelech noticed Abraham and said that God is with you. So Jacob's presence was helpful to Laban. And because the Lord had blessed Jacob and he was carrying the blessing of Abraham, he's gonna see that in Joseph's life. When he went down to Egypt, he carried the blessings of Abraham with him. He said that Joseph was prosperous. But we're going to see that later on. But here you have Jacob, Joseph's father. Now he's carrying this blessing of Abraham, and everywhere he goes, he's prosperous, and he's prospering this man, Laban. And here, but this man, Laban, is a greedy man, and he's holding Jacob and his family hostage here at this point. And then in verse 28, and he said, appoint me thy wages, and I will give it. See, he said, tell me your wages. See, Laban said that before, and now Jacob is not buying it. And he knows that any deal he's going to make with Laban, that Laban is going to get the upper hand. And he has now wised up, and now he's telling, I'm not going to fall for your tricks anymore. And in verse 29, and he said to him, thou knowest that I have served thee, and how thy cattle was with me. See, you know how I served you. And Jacob did really serve this man Laban. And he made it clear how he served him. Also, if you read in Genesis 31 verses 6, later on in the chapter, Joseph said, you know that I have served you with all my power. I have served you and your father. I have served you with all my power. Also in Genesis 31 verses 38 to 40, it says, these 20 years have I been with you. Thy ewes and thy she-goats have I not cast their young, and the rams of thy flock have I not eaten. That which was torn of beast I brought not unto thee. I bear the loss of it. Of my hand did thou require it, whether stolen by the day or stolen by the night. Thus I was in the day, drought consumed me, and frost by night, and sleep departed from my eyes. See, Jacob gave his best years to a wicked man. He gave his best years to a wicked man, because he fled and left Canaan. And the judgment of his deception of Esau now fell upon him. See, this man was supposed to be blessed in Canaan, but now this report that he just read, I just read in Genesis 31 verses 38 to 40 is what his judgment was, and for his deception. But here, moving on in Genesis chapter 30 verse 30, it says, for it was little which thou hast before I came, and now increased unto a multitude, and the Lord hath blessed thee since my coming. And now, when shall I provide for my own house? See, Jacob said, you had a little before I came, and now look, you have more. You have multitude. The Lord hath blessed you because of my coming. And again, the Abrahamic blessing was with Jacob, and in Jacob's presence, and it prospered Laban. And Jacob now is saying to Laban, when can I provide my own household? And it's time for my it's time for Jacob to lead the place now. You know, he had 2 wives, he had 12 sons, and he have a daughter to feed. And Laban is going to take him for a ride now. See? And Laban is taking him for a ride. And then it says in verse 30, in Genesis chapter 30, verse 31, it says, and he said, what shall I give thee? And Jacob said, thou shalt not give me anything. You see, if thou wilt do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep thy flock. I will pass through all the flock today, removing from tents all the speckled and spotted cattle, and all the brown cattle among the sheep, and the spotted and the speckled among the goats. And of such shall be my hire. And then verse 33 it says, so shall my righteousness answer for me in the time to come, when it shall come for my hire before thy face. Everyone that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and brown among the sheep, that shall be counted stolen with me. And Laban said, behold, I will, it might be according to thy word. And in other words, Laban is saying to Jacob, he said, what shall I give you? And, Jacob said, do not give me anything, if only you would, let me go. And I will in turn take care of your flock again. Again, in verse 32, it says, I will take care of the spotted cattle and goats and the half-breed. You take care of the pure ones, that we will be settled. That we can do this and we'll be settled. And we call it even. And it will be my compensation. And Laban said, let it be according to your word. So in verse 35, it says, and he removed that day the he-goats that were ring-raked and spotted, and all the she-goats that were speckled and spotted, and every one that has some white in it, and all the brown among the sheep, and he gave them into the hand of his sons. Speaking of Laban's sons. And he set 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob. And Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flock. And this, here he removed the cattle and the he-goats and that ring-rake spots and the she-goats and that were spotted and speckled, and gave them to his sons. Okay, Jacob's sons. And then he said 3 days journey, Jacob's sons. And he said 3 days journey between himself and Jacob and Laban. And Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. And then he says in verse 37, and Jacob took him rods of green poplar and the hazel and chestnut trees, and piled white rakes in them, and made the white appear which was in the rods. And here you see Jacob's tricks again. This is the old tricky way of Jacob, and he has never learned. He took rods of green poplar, and then of hazel and chestnut tree, and then piled the white streaks in them, and made them white appear, and which was in the rods. It says, and he set the rods which he had piled before the flocks in the gutters, in the watery troughs, when the flocks came to drink, that they should conceive when they came to drink. And the flocks conceived before the rods, and brought forth cattle, ring-raked, speckled, and spotted. Apparently this makes the cattle to conceive, and when they came to drink, and they conceived and brought forth cattle, ring-raked, speckled, and spotted. And then here he says in verse 40, and Jacob did separate the lambs, and set the faces of the flocks toward the ring-rake, and all the brown in the flock of Laban. And he put his own flocks by themselves, and put them not unto Laban's cattle. And here Jacob separated the lambs, and set their faces of the flocks towards the ring-rake, and all the brown in the flock of Laban. And then he put his own flock by themselves, and put them not in the with put them not in the cattle of Laban. And then in verse 41 it says, and it came to pass, whensoever the stronger cattle did conceive, that Jacob laid the rocks before the eyes of the cattle in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. But when the cattle were feeble, he put them not in. So the feebler were Laban's, and the strong were Jacob's. And the man increased exceedingly, and had much cattle, and maidservants, and menservants, and camels, and asses. And so basically he switched everything, and he put the stronger ones in his own, and then the weak ones at Laban. And this was Jacob's tricks. He's a master of deception, and he still has not learned his lesson after 20 years. And in verse 43, it says that the man, Jacob, increased much more, and had much cattle, and maidservants, and menservants, and camel, and asses. So this is what this man is going to do, and he's also going this by his own way tricks, using his own tricks again to deliver himself out of trouble. But God is going to deal with this man, and we're going to continue on, and we're going to see when God gets his hold of him, what happens. So until then, precious saints, God bless.